Marketing is about selling more stuff to more people more often for more money, more efficiently. That's what marketing is. I was the first ever chief marketing officer. And the reason I became the chief marketing officer is because I wanted to have a seat at the table.
Welcome to A History of Marketing. I'm Andrew Mitrak, and this week we're celebrating a small milestone, our 10th episode. So I'm doing something special. I'm releasing our first two-part episode of the podcast. And for that, we have an absolutely legendary guest, Sergio Zyman. Now, if you search for Sergio Zyman, the first thing that pops up is that he was the marketing mastermind behind New Coke, and the 1985 New Coke launch is frequently cited as one of the biggest marketing blunders of all time. Sergio doesn't give many interviews, and the handful I've seen tend to focus solely on the New Coke saga. But that's just a tiny sliver of an incredibly rich and fascinating career that's full of iconic product launches. I mean, he went on to become Coca-Cola's CMO, so there must be more to the story here, right? And that's exactly what we're covering in this two-part episode. In part one, we'll hear about Sergio Zyman's incredible, unlikely rise to leading Coca-Cola's marketing. Sergio was born in Mexico City, where he climbed the ladder at Procter Gamble and later the ad agency McCann Erickson. He moved to Japan to work on Nescafe and General Motors. Then he joined Pepsi, and by age 30, he was president of Pepsi in Brazil. It's a truly international career marked by the launch of iconic brands, all leading up to his success at Coca-Cola, where he'd launched Diet Coke, Cherry Coke, and yes, New Coke. He'd eventually be named the first chief marketing officer at Coca-Cola. And, according to Sergio, he was the first chief marketing officer in history, not just at Coke, but the first CMO of any company anywhere. By the way, I have no reason to doubt Sergio about this, but I'd like to verify this claim. I've scoured the major search engines and leading AI tools, and for what it's worth, I haven't found any record of anyone who held the CMO title before Sergio Zyman created the role at Coca-Cola in 1993. There were certainly other executives performing marketing functions, but the specific CMO title, it seems like Sergio Zyman may have actually been the first. So, listeners, I'm putting out a call to action. If you can find evidence of a CMO that predates Sergio Zyman, please reach out to me at hello@marketinghistory.org or share about it on social media and tag me. I'd love to get help with fact-checking this claim. So, with that out of the way, I'm excited to share this conversation with you. Sergio is brimming with personality, too much personality to fit into just one episode, so I think this will be a lot of fun. Now, without further ado, here's part one of my conversation with Sergio Zyman. Sergio Zyman, welcome to A History of Marketing.
Hey, how are you?
Great. So you've had a legendary career in marketing, but I want to start at the very beginning. You were born in Mexico City. I'm curious, what are your earliest memories of marketing and advertising when you grew up in Mexico City?
I wanted to get out of Mexico. Pretty much my family was in the clothing business and stuff like that, and I had no interest. I went to school in Europe. I traveled around the world a lot. And then I joined Procter and, through a variety of coincidences. And then I worked for Procter in marketing, which at the time was kind of almost like a cult. And then from there, I went into the ad agency and then on and on and on and on, traveled around the world, lived in Japan, lived in Brazil, and so forth.
And so Procter & Gamble is legendary for implementing the principles of modern brand management. What was joining Procter & Gamble in their marketing department like? You said it was almost like a cult. What was it that made it cult-like?
Well, most of the people that worked in Mexico at Procter were either, sons or daughters of expats, and primarily sons. They were primarily guys. And, we joined as a staff assistant. There was a very, very orderly progression. And then after a while, they sent you to sales training, which everybody hated. And, it was a locked wing of the company. It basically was housed across the street from the ad agency. And marketing was about managing product. Not managing product, but managing brands or launching brands. It was a lot of advertising and a lot of promotions and stuff like that. And I was part of the team that actually introduced a brand called Ariel, who became the largest brand in the world for Procter eventually. It was an enzyme detergent. I'm going to date myself many times here through this interview, but In Mexico at the time, people used to wash clothes on a stone with a bar of soap. And then after that, there was a product that Procter introduced in Mexico called Rapido. And the whole premise was that you can actually speed up. Rapido means quick. You could actually speed up the process of washing your clothes. From then on, we wanted to launch a product like Gain in the US. And then, I can't remember who came up with it, but the idea was that Ariel made every bucket a washing machine. And we had this visual where you put in the detergent to the bucket and the bucket will start moving like a washing machine. And it was a huge success.
Yeah. I want to quote from your book about Ariel and Procter & Gamble. I'm going to quote this. So, P&G had just introduced a detergent called Ariel, and the challenge was to convince skeptical Mexican housewives, most of whom did their washing by hand and didn't own a washing machine, that a packaged detergent could get the family's clothes as clean as whatever product they were currently using. So, you're a young man at this point, earlier in career. How do you research skeptical Mexican housewives? How do you know what it is that'll persuade them, or what the real challenge is to be solved with this
Well, I think
product?
that it was more about barriers, than anything else. I mean, research was very rudimentary. I don't even think that we use. I mean, I think we probably use some form of focus group at a time or something, but it was observational. I mean, you actually go look at the market, and every building, on top had, a place where it has a stone with little indentations in it. All you need to know is how the product was being used, right? And I think that was the genesis. A lot of the products at the time at Procter, the positioning of safeguard was that they eliminate bacteria, right? But I mean, there was really no big piece of research. I mean, we just hit on to something that was, I mean, it was probably when we ask people, why don't you buy a packaged detergent? They will tell you that, and I think that's how we ended up getting into that, but it was very rudimentary, you know?
Now, Procter & Gamble was your first job in marketing. Did you know that you wanted to be a marketer before you joined them, or did you kind of just fall into it once you came to this job at Procter & Gamble?
My number one objective was to get an American Express card. And you need to have an X amount of money, which is $200 less per year than what Procter was paying. So when I was looking around trying to get a job, I had come up, I mean, I had actually before that, I became the major coordinator for the Miss Mexico contest. And that's how I met some of the Procter guys. So, I didn't have a real career vision. I wanted to make some money. I knew I wanted to get out of Mexico. I wanted to work for an American company I mean, because usually American companies work Monday to Friday, not Monday to Saturday, which is what Mexican companies did. So there were a lot of criteria there that was kind of dumb, if you wish, right?
Hmm.
You know, and I met with a guy called Al Frost. My English was broken, even worse than today. And he asked me at one point in time during the interview, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I said, I don't know. I just want to have the power of knowledge to be able to make the decisions that I have to make down the road. And he fell in love with that thought and hired me. And that's how I got into Procter. I really did not fit the Procter criteria for being hired. Didn't go to school in the US at the time, didn't have parents that were expats in Mexico. My English was so so, but that's how I got in. When I got hired by McCann
Yeah.
to go work on the Coke business, I remember sitting in my very first meeting at McCann and they were doing media planning. And I sat there in panic and I said, I don't know anything about marketing.
Hmm.
I don't even know what marketing is. These people are talking about something totally different. Marketing became advertising. That's what marketing was. And I guess for a lot of companies today, still,
Hmm.
marketing is advertising. It's not real marketing. It's not linked really to the bottom line.
You mentioned you moved from Procter & Gamble to McCann Erickson. And for listeners who aren't familiar with McCann, they're a major advertising agency. I think they had been the agency of record for Coca-Cola since the 1950s. And for those who have seen the show Mad Men, this is the agency that swallows and absorbs Sterling Cooper at the end of the series. So what led you to McCann Erickson? Why did you join McCann after Procter & Gamble?
Money. The natural progression, I mean, I know it was more romantic, but the natural progression of Procter is you were at Procter, and then after about 7 or 8 months of just basically sitting around doing shipment analysis, they sent you to sales. They gave you the worst car that the sales department had, and they send you over to sell soap into public markets and little mom and pops. And then, I did that, and everybody hated it. And I figured out I was going to be I was going to do a good job. I ended up winning the contest the 3.5 months that are there, and I ended up getting hated by all the Procter guy, the marketing guys, because everybody those didn't want it to do well in sales. I came back, and then I became an assistant brand manager, and then I started getting offers. And the natural progression was that we were the source of quote unquote marketing people. So I got a job from Kimberly Clark, and then McCann. I had met the guy at McCann during the Miss Mexico thing, and I liked him a lot. And I went to be an account executive on the Coke business, which was sexy, and that's why I went. And it doubled my salary.
That's a good reason to move on and move upward.
I know.
So, what was the culture of McCann like this was probably the mid 70s or so, right? So, what was their company culture like?
The Coke relationship was very difficult because it was imposed by Atlanta.
Mm.
So, pretty much, you couldn't go and choose your own ad agency. Okay. It was McCann or else. And the guys at Coke had come from sales. Most of the guys that were in the quote unquote, the VP marketing there or marketing director at Coke was a sales guy,
Mm-hmm.
and it was about dealing with bottlers and stuff like that. And there was always an antagonistic relationship. We adapted advertising that was created in Atlanta, was called the pattern advertising. And we did a good job with it, but there was always tension, between us and the Coke guys. It was not a happy relationship. It was just you did what you needed to do.
Yeah.
There's an interesting digress. I was thinking about this interview, and when did marketing come to these companies? If you go back and you look at fast feeders, the Wendy's head of marketing was a guy called Mike Welter. The marketing guy at McDonald's was Paul Schrage. I don't know who the marketing guy at Burger King was, but pretty much what happened to these companies
Mm-hmm.
as they started opening up more and more stores, they realized that they needed to communicate with the consumer and explain to them why they should go and buy this stuff. Right? There was not a lot of competition, and the powers to be in these companies, whenever they wanted a marketing guy, they said, "Wow, I think that we better get it out of the agency." So Schrage was the ad agency guy. Welker was the ad agency guy,
Mm-hmm.
and so was at Burger King. So that's where the guy at Coke, who was the head of marketing at the time, Ike Herbert, was a McCann guy. So it was all about advertising. Advertising actually dominated the marketing function, in a lot of companies. It wasn't about truly kind of doing marketing the way we knew it. And I always felt very uncomfortable about it. I didn't want it to be an ad guy. I thought that it was it was not a great label for me. It was not, I was kind of a trinkets and trash guy. I was not a businessman. So that's kind of where my formation as the kind of the challenger of the marketing function became.
I want to ask you about your impression of the ads that were created for Coca-Cola, because McCann, of course, they had created the famous Coca-Cola Hilltop commercial with the jingle "Buy the World of Coke," and it's a really is an incredible commercial, and it's one of the most famous advertisements in history. But Coca-Cola almost became kind of a victim of this ad success and ads like this, where they internalize this happy, smiley people with the Coca-Cola bottle in their hand, and this was the formula for them. And it sounds like you were sort of questioning, was this actually driving sales? Was this actually working at the end of the day?
Well, look, I think that there is a lot of mythology, about advertising for Coke. So, there was a guy at McCain called Bill Backer, who eventually left and went and built Backer Spielvogel. And he was a really, really kind of creative, artistic guy. And there was a music guy there called Billy. My God, I just forgot his last name. And Billy had actually sung with the Four Tops before he became the music director for McCann. And they were going to do a radio spot called "I Like to Buy the World a Coke," and they wanted to do it. They went to record it in London, because that's how you did buyouts. And the commercial became an accident. It had no strategy behind it. And then everybody fell in love with it. And, Coke sales kept on going south for a long time because Pepsi was really the marketing director for Coke. Pepsi was
Mhm.
determining the dialogue for Coke wasn't,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. I just looked it up, by the way. It must be Billy Davis.
Billy Davis, exactly.
That's it. Okay.
Really, yeah. Good guy.
You
Really
you
good.
mentioned that Pepsi was really the creative driver for Coca-Cola, and I'm gonna quote from your book again. This was the 1970s, and Pepsi had just started with their quote new generation approach. McCann's philosophy, which was the same as the rest of the industries, including Coke's, was grab their hearts and their wallets will follow. So we kept coming up with ads that made people feel good, made them cry, and won us awards. And that's the end of your quote. But it kind of the implication is it goes on to say like these ads didn't really seem to be working at the end of the day as far as new business and sales were going.
Well, they were not. Remember,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in the old days, Pepsi was not a viable choice for people who drank soft drinks.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, we didn't have 10,000 different options. Okay, you had Coke and you had Pepsi, and then it was all driven by manufacturing. Sprite was created in the UK in order to be able to actually fill the bottling lines because they weren't selling enough. There was no strategy behind it.
Hmm.
And, Pepsi then decided in order to kind of, they say that get out of the kitchen and into the living room, that they needed to become a viable option to Coke. And they had a very good strategy because they started discounting in supermarkets, they started multi packing. Coke just didn't believe in that. They believed that all they needed to be is kind of this grab your hearts and their wallets will follow. But Pepsi basically said that they never said, Coke sucks. I mean, what they said was Pepsi's for the new generation. And the implication was that Coke was for the old folks. So they called it the Pepsi generation. There was a guy at Pepsi that was very smart about that, Alan Potash. And then after that, they did the Pepsi challenge where basically they said, by the way, they never said Pepsi tasted better. It just showed that people chose it. So they were always doing that stuff. And then when I became marketing director, and by the way, you can look at the quotes out there. I became, Pepsi basically said that I snuck up on them because I said enough, right? I hired Bill Cosby at the time to do a bunch of advertising to basically say, there wouldn't be a challenger if there was not a number one. We launched the Coke is It, which was a very, very successful ad campaign that, by the way, McCann took credit for, but it was developed in Canada for the Canadian market. So
Right.
there are a lot of secrets along the way about how these things came about.
Yeah, we'll get to all of those stories, but I want to come back to while you're still at McCann, you said you're an account executive on the Coca-Cola account. And over time, I've become less impressed when someone comes up with a good idea and more impressed when someone can convince their client to get behind the good idea. And that's kind of the role of the account executive in a lot of ways,
Well,
right?
Coke had this thing, as I mentioned before, called pattern advertising, right? So they developed
Mhm.
a series of commercials. They did Have a Coke and a Smile. They did at the time, is the real thing, right? The advertising is the real thing. And it was shoved down to everybody around the world. Our job at the agency was to translate it and adapt it. And then we had to go and sell it to the client. But we were not coming up with a lot of original kind of marketing ideas to grow volume, right? It was all about, I mean, we were implementing whatever was coming down from the north. And even in, up in at headquarters and later on when I was at headquarters, it was kind of the agency drove and dominated the whole communication and marketing thing. I mean, the
Mhm.
Coke marketing folks were ex-salesmen. They were not really, there was no strategy. Coke was a distribution company. They had a great product and a great idea, and then they developed a distribution network around the world. There were a lot of people that wanted a franchise, and that's how they
Mhm.
ended up growing for a long time. At one point in time, they actually needed to go vertically, and that's when the company started changing and the company started really, but it was all about launching bigger bottles or different sizes or plastic bottles or stuff like that. You didn't really kind of had a kind of a real marketing strategy coming out of the company. There was a group at McCann who went off into this quiet lab and they'll come in and they'll make a presentation about how we were going to go to the next level. And we had this stupid piece of research, which was 13 elements of imagery, right? And it was about how much the consumer love us, not how much the consumer buy us, but how much they love us,
Yeah.
And it was very frustrating.
You were at McCann, and eventually, of course, you went to have a very successful career at Coca-Cola. But before that, you actually joined Pepsi, their top competitor in
No,
Brazil,
actually,
right?
no. So I went from McCann in Mexico, and I saw Jim Camo, who was the president of McCann, came to visit in Mexico, and the president of the Mexican company called me up at McCann and said, by the way, Jim Camo is here. Would you like to see him? And I said, yeah, great. Oh, he likes to see you. So I went down to meet Gene, and he said, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to go international. I want to get out of Mexico. I tell him all the reasons. And 3 months later, I get a call that says, I'm transferring to Japan. And I said, Japan? And I said, why Japan? And they said, because if you make it in Japan, you make it anywhere. So I went to Japan as an account executive again to work on the GM business. They had bought Isuzu in Japan, and they were trying to create a pattern model for advertising around the world. And I also worked on Nestle. And in Japan, the Japanese are very methodical, as you know, and they were selling Nescafe, which was the number one brand for Nestle around the world. But then when it came to the spring, the Japanese went and got a haircut, switched their suits from winter to summer, and stopped drinking coffee. Just stopped. So we came up with a cold drink out there, and I worked on that. I was there for a year and a half, incredible experience living in Japan. So then I got a call saying that I wanted to go back to the States. I went to New York, and they offered me a job as a account supervisor on the Coke New York, the bottler at New York. And I said, you know what? I need to get the New York experience. I got to check that thing. So I took the job, and it was a nothing job. And all we did is we took the client for dinner. I mean, we didn't do anything meaningful. And then Pepsi started asking me to join them, and they offered me like 5 or 6 jobs. They were all kind of odd jobs, and I didn't want it to be in that. And then eventually, McCann, I went to Central America to be general manager of the Central American company. And then when I was there, they asked me whether I wanted to interview for a marketing job in Brazil. And I had just gotten married. My wife was pregnant. And I said, you know what? Take a free trip to Brazil. What the hell? I don't think nothing is going to come out of it. I went to Brazil, and the job actually was to develop an advertising campaign, even though I was a marketing guy. And I said, well, I can do that. Okay, I know how to do that. So I took the job as head of marketing for Pepsi Brazil. And we moved to Brazil, which was a great experience. My daughter was born there. We lived there 3.5 years. About 2 years in, my boss gets transferred to Venezuela, and I get promoted at age 30 to be president of the company. And I was over my head beyond I didn't know what I was doing.
In your book, you say, when I got there being Brazil, I found out that Pepsi Brazil had the same advertising philosophy as Coke, but to make things worse, Coke was outselling us there 10 to 1. Not good. I knew that with the odds so heavily against us, and with comparatively no penetration in the market, the only way we could dig ourselves out would be an ad campaign that provided a contrast between us and Coke. So we came up with the Pepsi Challenge. And I'm wondering, what were the origins of the Pepsi Challenge? You were at Pepsi when the Pepsi Challenge was launched. What did the rollout of that look like? How did that start?
Pepsi was doing some spectacular advertising with the puppies and the shows of new generation, great jingles and all that. And there was an agency in Dallas, Texas that came up with the Pepsi Challenge. And in the old days, you know, you didn't go negative, right? You kind of came out and told people why you were the right candidate or why you were the right product and all that stuff, but you never went negative. The only time you went negative is when you had nothing to say. And Pepsi had tried everything to get out of the kitchen and into the living room. And all they were trying to find a way to be equally considered by consumers. In Brazil, I had no money. I had no budget. And, I didn't come up with Pepsi Challenge. It came out of Dallas. But then we started doing it in Brazil. It didn't go as well as it went in the States because in Brazil, people frowned at negative advertising, right? But all that changed over the years,
At a tactical level in Brazil, when you're doing this, was it pop-ups in supermarkets and public areas where people could try them both? Were you filming these and putting them on TV? What did the mechanics of the advertising of the campaign rollout look like there?
We basically did taste test, right? Blind taste test. And you did enough blind taste tests until you won. The moment you won, right, you stopped. You didn't have to do anymore. So you kept on filming these very rudimentary spots. And then once you got to the number where you can claim that, more people prefer the taste of Pepsi to the taste of Coke, you didn't have to do anymore.
If you ever lose, you can just stop that ad and not run that one or something, right?
No, you don't.
Yeah,
You never, you won't lose because the chances of a sweeter product, which is what Pepsi was, eventually you didn't have to win by a large margin. You could lose. All you need to do is have 51%. More people prefer the taste of, in taste test, in Rio, more people prefer the taste of Pepsi to the taste of Coke. That's it.
Yeah.
And I would do things like when we would launch a new flavor or something, I would take all the trucks and I would do a parade to the cities of Rio or Sao Paulo, as a way to do that. I didn't have any money. And I learned a lot. And then they decided to restructure Pepsi down in South America. They put together a group with Bolivia, Argentina, and everything else. And they brought in a guy called Roger Enrico. And Roger arrived in Brazil. And, I did. The flight arrived at 5 o'clock in the morning. I sent a car and a driver and a letter saying, "Welcome to Brazil. I'm at your service. Let me know. I'm sure you want to rest." He got all offended about it, hated me from day one. He came into the office and wanted to take my office because he now was the guy for South America. So he fired me a year later. So now I am in Brazil with my wife. She's pregnant with my second kid, and I'm fired. So I said to my wife, I said, "We're going back to Mexico." She said, "I don't want to go back to Mexico." I said, "Guess what? That's the place that I can actually retool and figure out what I'm going to do." But then John Scully, who was president of Pepsi North America, heard that what happened, and he said, "We're not losing Sergio." So they moved me to New York against Rogers, desires. And then I went to be director of marketing for brand Pepsi in New York. But it was a nothing job too, because it was all about
Yeah.
advertising.
I've got to ask you about John. You mentioned John Scully, of course, later became CEO of Apple. Did you work with John Scully, and what were your impressions of him?
John was a incredibly cerebral guy, very introverted. And I worked with him and I worked with Ted Glover, who had then moved to New York as well. And then I got a call from Brian Dyson, who I had competed against in Brazil. And he said, "By the way, I'm back in the States. I'm running Coke North America. You want to have lunch next time I'm in New York?" I said, "Sure." And we went to have lunch at the Bull and Bear at the Waldorf. And then as we were sitting having lunch, suddenly Don Keogh, who was the president of North America by accident, shows up at the window and waves at Brian, comes in, sits down, and pretty much starts querying me about what I thought about Coke. And I said, I think you guys are screwed up. I think you have had so many advantages and you just give him all up. And I gave him a bunch of examples. And he said, "Well, we're not that bad." I said, "By the way, I'm not here. I'm just having lunch with Brian. I didn't even think that they were interviewing me. And then later on, Brian offered me a job to go down to Atlanta. And I went down to Atlanta. I got an offer, very good job. And then from then on, lots of stories.
Lots of stories. So you joined Coca-Cola in 1979. To quote your book, you say, "That's when I found out exactly what happened after those ads I'd worked on at McCann were sent off to the media and aired 20,000 gazillion times, and I was shocked. Nothing happened. All those beautiful, heart-grabbing, award-winning ads that were supposed to be getting people to buy Coke weren't having much of an effect." So was this really the time when you learned that the advertising wasn't actually working at all once you had moved to in-house at Coca-Cola?
Yes. But there was, Coke was really, I found out when I got hired that the reason they hired me was to pick up the secrets from Pepsi. And, they really didn't treat me well when I got there. I mean, it was kind of almost like a joke. I was a token Pepsi guy and kind of a spy, and Coke was such a fraternal, belonging only, not performing company that, and all of a sudden I started doing things which were so bad. Like I went down to lunch one day, and I'm an avid runner. And at the time I was really running a lot. And the only thing they had in the cafeteria was chili dogs and really fat stuff. So I convinced that they put in a salad bar. And I became like this terrible person. They'll scratch my car in the parking lot. Uh, and I know it was awful.
Do you think that you being from Mexico had something to do with that? Do you think it was a prejudice or?
But for me, being Mexican was kind of, I knew that I was in a minority. I knew that people didn't see me correct. Even at McCann in New York, my own friends, in New York always kind of said, why do we need a Mexican guy to be in New York, right? There was always discrimination, but I just took it as part of the course. I had to work through it, you know. But the advertising was very guarded at Coke, and it was managed by a whole different group, kind of corporately. You were not allowed to touch anything, do anything. I remember when after a while, they had all kinds of people who left, and I was named director of marketing for the US. And I tried to hire people, and I hired a couple of marketing people from Procter and other places. I remember there was a guy called Richard Chernowski, and he came to see me one day, and he said, look, I tried to talk to the product guys about what's going on with the product, and they said I'm not allowed because that's a corporate thing. I tried to talk to advertising to this guy, John Gillen, who is kind of a protege of the president and the son of a cousin. And, I'm not allowed to talk about advertising. The packaging is done by corporate, and I'm not, what am I doing here? That was the issue. So the thing that kind of I started then becoming kind of the guy that will come up with challenges. How do we break, what do we do in order to do something totally different? We went out with sponsor Hands Across America, and we did all kinds of things that were stupid in today's world, right? But then the thing kept on growing that way. Eventually I became, the head of marketing, for North America. I ended up being the project manager on Diet Coke. It got canceled twice. I did New Coke and Diet Coke and Coke is it and things like that, but it was so hard. It was really hard. It was counterculture.
I want to ask you a little bit about some of these launches during this period. Can you share the story of Diet Coke? We kind of take it for granted that Diet Coke is one of the options today, but it didn't exist until you were there and really oversaw some of the launch of that. So how did
Well,
that
so
go?
remember, I was Attila the Hun, right? I was there to destroy the status quo. So anytime Brian will call me up and would say, what do we do now? Like, I will come in with these cannonballs things. And, Tab had a 3 share. Pepsi had two brands, Pepsi Light and Diet Pepsi. Together they had 4.1. Anything that we did to grow Tab was just tough because Tab had been positioned as a diet drink. And the number one benefit of Tab was that it tasted, because it had saccharin, right? So people saw it as a way to punish themselves so they could go in and have 3 hamburgers. When I started the project initially, I started doing a lot of work on it with with 2 guys only. I was actually semi being the executive assistant to the president of the company as well. We went to Brazil. We were in Brazil. That's the time that Paul Austin, who was the chairman at the time, they discovered he had Alzheimer's, and there was a change in management. And then we got an email saying stop all work on Diet Coke, and then the project got canceled. They had agreed with me that I was going to go to Harvard for the 13-week, post grad, and I was leaving, so I was going to go to Harvard. Then Roberto gets named CEO of the company. Project gets reinstated, becomes Project Harvard, and I said I want to have a different ad agency, and they said okay. Literally after that meeting, I went to the airport. I went to New York, and I hired Lintas before McCann had a chance to react. And of course, that made me persona non grata, right? Remember at the time, Madison Avenue saw me as this struck. I mean, I was, they named me the Ayacola, at the time.
So
Uh,
Ayacola being a pun on Ayatollah, which was right.
right, exactly. And I mean, my view about it every time was advertising needs to sell product, and they say no, 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 no. Advertising needs to do these great commercials and entertain people. Look at the success of Mint Joe Green, and I like to buy the world of Coke and blah blah blah. And I mean, we got into a massive fight for years about it. And I still believe today, that the thing is all broken. But I just kept on going about it. And then, I got introduced to Goizueta and I said, sir, I'm going to go away. And if I come back with a proposition to you, you're going to have no choice but to approve it because it's going to be a non-assailable proposition. We walk out of the meeting and Keo says, you almost got fired there by talking like that to the chairman. I said, what did I do? I mean, all I said was I wasn't going to just go play with this thing, that if I found out that there was no viability for the project. So we went and we hired a design company called I went non-traditional on everything, right? And we hired this guy, Alvin Schechter, who was really, really smart. He had done a lot of industrial stuff. I wanted somebody that had not done consumer products. That was every time I tried to kind of do it sideways. And in one of the meetings, he was talking about the fact that the thinness of the lines on the Diet Coke can, you know, had to be enough to have the equity of brand Coke on it. And I was rolling my eyes and saying, I said, wait a minute, we cannot launch a diet drink. We need to launch a regular drink with no calories. And everybody looked at me like an idiot. And I said, it has to have all the imagery because a brand is made up of 5 components of imagery, right? Product imagery, user imagery, brand imagery, usage imagery, and trademark imagery. So eventually, making a long story short, we ended up with a product that was sweetened with saccharin initially, but basically we launched it on a platform of taste with a big jingle. Say you got to drink it just for the taste of it, and we launched it in Radio City with the Rockettes. So that's how we got around the thing. And I left, I went to Harvard, and then they kind of corporate took over the product. They tried to launch it around the world, and it failed miserably everywhere around the world. And the reason for that is because they were launching it as a diet drink. When I came back to the company, I just changed the nomenclature from Diet Coke to Coke Light, and volume went through the roof, you know? And that's how Diet Coke, there's a lot of stories behind Diet Coke and a lot of insight about it. Same story with New Coke.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories, and we're at time for our interview today. We're going to do a follow-up because we've covered, a lot of your career from Mexico to Japan to the US to Brazil, back to New York and Atlanta. But we're still, there's decades and decades of the rest of your career. I want to talk about Tab Clear and the takeout of Crystal Pepsi, of course, New Coke, the founding of the Zyman Group, your advising to politicians on political campaigns, also some of your consulting work with Microsoft. Just so many stories to keep going through your career. So I'm gonna follow up with you, and we'll schedule a part 2 of this conversation.
Well, let me finish with one comment only. Remember, my philosophy is marketing, and I learned that over the years. Marketing is about selling more stuff to more people more often for more money, more efficiently. That's what marketing is, right? And it's not just a moniker. It's selling more stuff, which is volume, or more money, which is profit, more efficiently, which is spending as little as you can. And then it's about penetration and usage, right? And I think that when we talk again, we got to talk about those philosophies which are still not embedded in the company today. I was the first ever chief marketing officer. And the reason I became the chief marketing officer, and we can talk about it as well, is because I wanted to have a seat at the table, right? Now, everybody's a chief marketing officer. They're not. They don't have any responsibility for bottom line, right? So we'll talk some more.
Absolutely. Well, I'm really looking forward to it, Sergio. Thanks so much for your time. This has been an absolute blast. I really enjoyed this conversation so much. So thank you again, and we'll talk again soon.
All right, take care.
Before I get to my usual sign off, I want to extend a very special thank you to 2 people who were instrumental in making this interview happen: Mark Cruz and Joe Michaels. Both Mark and Joe are former managers of mine, and I'm incredibly fortunate to count them as mentors and as friends. In fact, when I first shared my plans for making a history of marketing as a podcast series, Mark and Joe both independently suggested Sergio Zyman as a must-have guest. It turns out they both worked with Sergio in consulting roles, Mark during his time at Microsoft, and Joe when he was at a dot-com era startup. Their insights were invaluable as I researched and prepared for this interview. And it was Joe who actually put me in touch with Sergio, making this conversation possible. So, Mark and Joe, if you're listening, thank you for everything. A History of Marketing is written and produced by me, Andrew Mittrack. If you'd like new episodes delivered right to your inbox, visit marketinghistory.org. There you can also find transcripts of every conversation, including helpful links, images, videos, and other blog posts about marketing history. You can send me an email at hello@marketinghistory.org. If you'd like to support A History of Marketing, consider leaving a review on your favorite podcasting app, or better yet, tell a friend about the show. Thanks for listening.